Welcome, everyone. This is it's Mark Davidson. I'm serving as the Executive Director for Voices for Justice in Palestine. We are a new organization. We've just merged between two predecessor organizations, two social justice nonprofits, Coalition for Peace with Justice and Abrahamic Initiative on the Middle East. And we are very excited to welcome you to our webinar this evening on perspectives on the one state. Where do we go from here? We're very delighted to have two outstanding presenters in Peter Beinart and Yousef Munayyer. I'll say a word or two about the topic and introduce them in just a minute. But first, let me introduce Sanjida Ahmed, who is our Communications and Operations Manager, and she'll give you a few words about our procedure for tonight. Sanjida.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sanjida Ahmed. As Mark said, I'm the Operations and Communications Manager for Voices and Justice for Palestine. I'm just going to be handling sort of the technical and logistical side of things. So as you all know, this is a webinar, so we're not going to have any audio or video for the attendees. But the way you can engage is through the chat. So if you have any questions, please put them in the chat, and then we'll have people reviewing them and then select them to answer using the last 30 minutes. So we'll hopefully get to several of your questions. And just make sure that to make your questions as brief as possible so that we can get to as many questions as possible. The webinar will be recorded and it'll be available later on our website, our Facebook, and social media, and I'll send it all to you as well. And the last thing is, at the very end, there's a very quick survey. It's literally one question. I just want you to sort of check how you found out about the webinar to make it easier on our end to do future publicity work. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to our amazing speakers.
Okay, folks, we're so glad to have you with us. Let me say just a few words about the one state. The conversation about a just and sustainable peace in Palestine-Israel is shifting in new and exciting ways. The two-state solution, which was the reigning orthodoxy for decades, is widely recognized to have collapsed. Several people and several groups still cling to it and believe it may still be viable, but generally the consensus among a growing number of scholars and activists is that it's time to move on to another solution. In current political discourse then, there is renewed interest in the one state, a binational democracy between the river and the sea with freedom, security, and equal rights for all of its citizens. Gideon Levy describes it this way. He says, the fate of all the human beings living between the river and the sea is determined in the government buildings in Jerusalem and the security buildings in Tel Aviv. The only struggle that remains to be carried out now is the struggle for equal rights for all. And Ian Lustig, in his book, Paradigm Lost, describes it this way. He said, there is today one and only one state ruling the territory between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River, and its name is Israel. So the question for us, and which we're going to explore in some depth in this webinar, is what does the one state mean? What does it portend for the future? What are the challenges and promises of the one state solution? And to help us with that tonight, we have two outstanding speakers. Let me introduce them to you. Peter Beinart is Professor of Journalism and Political Science at the City University of New York. He's also a contributor to The Atlantic, a CNN political commentator, editor-at-large of Jewish Currents, and a non-resident fellow at the Foundation for Middle East Peace. His third book, The Crisis of Zionism, published in 2012, chronicled the growth of disaffection with Israel among young American Jews. Beinart has written for the New York Times and numerous national and international newspapers, magazines, and journals. Mr. Beinart is a graduate of Yale University with graduate study at Oxford University as a Rhodes Scholar. His recent article in Jewish Currents, Yavna, A Jewish Case for Equality in Israel-Palestine, and his op-ed in the New York Times announcing his abandonment of the two-state solution as morally indefensible have been much discussed. Yousef Munayyer is a Palestinian-American writer and scholar. He's a non-resident fellow at Arab Center, Washington, D.C., where he writes on Israel-Palestine. Formerly, he served as executive director of the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights and is a member of the editorial committee of the Journal of Palestine Studies. Some of his published articles can be found in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, The Nation, Foreign Policy, Journal of Palestine Studies, Middle East Policy, and others. The frequently consulted source for Palestinian perspectives on wide-ranging developments in Israel-Palestine. Dr. Munayyer holds a PhD in international relations and comparative politics from the University of Maryland. So a warm welcome to both of our speakers. We're so glad you're here. And we're going to start by asking each of you to give us a kind of a general overview of what you mean by the one state and why you advocate for it. Why is it that this is your position and why you hold it? And we'll start, I'd like to start with you, Yousef, on this. So your thoughts about the one state in general.
Sure, thank you so much, Mark and Sanjita, for having us for this conversation, and for everybody in the community in North Carolina, where we have many friends among the committed activists for peace and justice there. I hope everybody tuning in is doing as best as possible during these circumstances, and one day we'll be able to have events in person again and see each other in person again. So thank you for putting this conversation together. So in regards to your question, the way that I see it is that, first of all, we talk about a one-state solution, right? And what is a solution if not an answer to a problem? And for me, when we talk about the one-state solution, I always depart from the point of thinking about how it addresses the problem. And to have that conversation, we have to have some sort of shared consensus about what the problem is. And so for me, it's always been fairly straightforward to reach this conclusion about a single state with equal rights because of how I understand the problem, what I understand the problem to be. And from my perspective, and I think from the perspective of many other Palestinians, and surely others beyond Palestinians as well, the problem is not one of contested national movements or one of deeply rooted ancient religious hatreds or whatever other nonsense we might often hear this reduced to. But rather a matter of settler colonialism. And there is, a national movement in the Zionist movement that ultimately established an ethno-nationalist state, and in many ways was a nationalist movement, remains a nationalist movement, but it cannot be divorced from the settler colonialist origins of the movement, and in fact the structures and processes of settler colonialism, which were established by the Zionists over a century ago, continued very much on a uninterrupted historical trajectory to the point that we are today. And when one views the problem through the lens of settler colonialism, it becomes far clearer to see why a single state with equal rights is the most appropriate solution for the problem. And so along with addressing the problem as I see it, the one state solution also, and this is related to the settler colonialism prism, addresses the largest possible number of stakeholders in the issue. And so when one thinks about, for example, the conventional two-state solution, as we've often heard it discussed by diplomats and officials and so on, The vision is basically one of a Israeli state and a Palestinian state, you know, perhaps in parentheses, at best case, it is an entity with unequal sovereignty to the Israeli state. And that may in some ways address Palestinian stakeholders in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip who continue to live under Israeli military occupation. But it doesn't answer questions for Palestinian citizens of Israel. It doesn't answer questions for Palestinian refugees who are never seriously dealt with in the two-state framework and are the single largest number of Palestinian stakeholders and really the center of the Palestinian issue. And so, you know, from my perspective, a one-state solution addresses all of these stakeholders as well as Israelis on different sides of the Green Line and can incorporate both the rights and interests of all of those communities within the territory and outside of the territory that have a connection or claim to land there. For that reason, I think it is far more of a serious attempt at trying to resolve the problem than the two-state. The last reason that I will give here, I'm sure we'll have plenty more to discuss later on this, is in my view, one state continues to be a far more practical outcome than a solution of partition. For one, for the reason that Mark, you mentioned in your introduction, I can't remember who you were quoting, but there continues to be one state that is dominating this territory today, a singular state. It is the Israeli state. It rules over the entirety of the territory, albeit in different ways and with different relationships to the Palestinians there. But nonetheless, there is one ultimate entity that is in control as a state within this space. That's the reality that exists today. And, you know, I also think it's important to point out that historically, that's often how it's been. When one thinks about the history of this territory, you have to go back a really, really, really long way in history to find a time when this territory was divided up and not under a common rule, whoever it was, from the Romans to the Byzantines to the Umayyads to the Mamluks to the Ottomans to the whatever, right? You know, Haifa and Nablus were never separated throughout history, you know? Lyd and Jericho were never separated throughout history, right? This is a territory that historically these communities, these towns, these cities have been within the same geographic orbit, right? And undivided for a very, very long, long time. And for that reason, there are all sorts of logistical, geographic, economic practicalities that have developed as a result of that, that both relate to land and people, that make keeping this all under a single entity far more practical than dividing it. And there are many, many reasons why we could go into the impracticality of division. But those for me are sort of the three main reasons. It addresses the problem as I see it. It addresses the largest number of stakeholders, and it remains a more practical outcome.
Thank you, Yousef. Peter, your thoughts about one state in your thinking these days and why it's important from your perspective.
Sure. And again, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure. Let me start maybe where Yousef did on the question of settler colonialism, because I think I have a slightly different perspective than him. On the question of Zionism as settler colonialism, I would say something like yes, but, or maybe yes, and, which is to say there's no question that Zionism has settler colonial features. You don't have to read Palestinian writing even to know that. You can read Zionist writing. The colonialism was not a dirty word. for many Zionists in the late 19th and early 20th century. And of course, the Zionist movement gained the support of powerful elements in Europe, and it had a discourse about modernization, about progress, indeed even about replacement that is common to other settler colonial movements. But I think it's also important to foreground, this is important to me to foreground, that this was also a movement of Jews who felt very deeply, and indeed is deeply engraved into our tradition, a connection to this land. There's even the most superficial familiarity with Jewish religious tradition shows how central that is. And secondly, that this was also a movement of people who felt, starting in the late 19th century and with increasing alarm into the middle of the 20th century, that they were in grave peril. It's interesting, one of the people who I think has kind of captured this duality, I found with the most kind of in the most generous and I think sophisticated way, is Edward Said, who writes in his book, The Question of Palestine, the absolute wrong of settler colonialism, here he's talking about Zionism, is very much diluted and perhaps even dissipated when it is a fervently believed in Jewish survival that uses settler colonialism to straighten out its own destiny. I guess I say that by way of thinking about what I mean by one state, which is that I think of this as a binational state, a state that would need to have democracy for all of its citizens and a strong protection, even for minority rights. Yousef has written, I think, very compellingly about that, among many other things, about the importance of a strong Supreme Court and a Bill of Rights, but also a state that would allow each of these two people, each of these two nations, to express their national autonomy within a single political framework. I think that there is a one-state reality now, and there was a time, certainly, that in which I believe that partition, which would have ended Israel's occupation over Palestinians in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, could have been the beginning, a step forward towards a deeper resolution. It would have left serious problems unresolved. For instance, Israel's own internal transformation that would have been necessary for its own Palestinian citizen population, and it would have not solved the refugee problem, and would have needed to find ways of ultimately doing that. But whether that could have been in some alternative universe a first step, I think is now moot, because the Israeli project of entrenching its control in the West Bank and East Jerusalem is now far too deeply entrenched. And so I think that it makes the most sense to try to imagine one political entity, whether it's a federation that provides kind of autonomy within one political space, or even a confederation in which you basically have two separate entities that pool a lot of their features of sovereignty in the way that countries in the EU do, for instance. I think that responds to the one-state reality we have now. Responds, as Yousef rightly said, to the need for Palestinian refugees to have a right of return, and responds to the need of both peoples to have safety and freedom in this territory. I think that in reality, I think it is probably fair to say that binational states are difficult. When you have, this would not be a country that had a strong overarching identity in its early years. In that way, it would be different than South Africa, let's say, where you had a strong overarching South African identity, even in the midst of kind of brutal racial oppression and fighting. This would be a state that would start out, it seems to me, with a very thin overarching national identity and very, very strong a subnational Jewish and Palestinian identity. But I do think that that what you see in binational states and divided societies is that those that offer everyone a voice, as equal a voice as possible in government, are ultimately more stable and more peaceful. And that for all of, my friends that, and others who say Israel cannot become a binational state, Israel-Palestine already is a binational state. And there seems to be very, very little prospect that will change. So the real question seems to me is not whether binational states are difficult, they are difficult, but whether binational states work better for all of their people when everyone has the right to be represented in their government and live equally under the law. And I think that would be the case in Israel-Palestine.
Okay, thank you both. Peter, let me explore a little bit with you some of the ways in which the sort of a Jewish ethics, especially your reference to tikkun, to the moral, spiritual, ethical work of repair, how that would apply. And so let me ask it this way. I noticed in your Jewish Currents essay on the one state, you say that the real tikkun is equality, a Jewish home that is also a Palestinian home, that this project involves an end to dehumanizing Palestinians, casting them as Nazis and compulsive Jew haters. I think those were specific words you used to talk about that dehumanization. And your hope that this may allow the Jewish people to free themselves from the trauma of the Holocaust, concluding that only Palestinian freedom can make Jews whole. Could you say more about this role of psychic healing and trust building in the work of building a state for all its citizens?
Sure. It may seem odd for me to talk about repair as it relates to Jews, since obviously Palestinians are the ones who are suffering so profoundly and whose material and political and legal and economic situation needs such a massive tikkun, a massive repair. But what I meant in that particular sentence or sentences that you quoted was that what I think needs to happen for Jews is that as you know, and as most people who follow this know, that in Jewish discourse, the Holocaust and the creation of the State of Israel are very frequently twinned together. They are seen as a kind of common narrative. That's part of the reason I think that the Palestinian narrative is so often willfully ignored and lost, because the Palestinian narrative, of course, is a narrative of settler colonialism, which starts back in the late 19th century. But for the kind of common narrative of Jews is that essentially Jews didn't have a country for 2,000 years. This culminated in the extermination of 2/3 of the Jews of Europe, and then the creation of a state that was a tikkun, that was a repair for this trauma, because it meant it would never happen again, because there would always be a Jewish army to ensure, right, that there was never another Holocaust. What I tried to suggest in the piece, and this is not original to me, many others have plowed this ground, but that in an ironic way, what the creation of the State of Israel and its policies have done is that in order to justify what Israel has done, Jews have had to put Palestinians in the role of Nazis. Of course, needless to say, a deeply, deeply dehumanizing role, and one that, of course, then permits all kinds of terrible abuses. But essentially, in this narrative, the Palestinians become the new Nazis, and Israel becomes the force that is keeping us from a second Holocaust at their hand. Now, sometimes the Iranians or others might come in and play a kind of a cameo role in this narrative, but in the long durée, it's really been Palestinians. And so the notion of the Holocaust as the template for Jewish existence, that it is always 1938. Menachem Begin spoke this way constantly. Benjamin Netanyahu speaks this way constantly, essentially requires the Palestinians to be in this Nazi role. And the Palestinians can never disprove this, right, unless they are actually given freedom, right? Because as long as you're holding them down, the implication will always be, well, if you allowed them to actually have any political power or influence to express themselves, then they would reveal that the fact that they just want to kill Jews, right? So in a way, this narrative can only ultimately be moved past when there is Palestinian equality, and when the obviously, wildly misguided notion that Palestinians are Nazis, that the essence of Palestinian political identity is the desire to kill Jews simply because that's what Palestinians like to do, that's what I mean by the idea of a tikkun. That it is ultimately Palestinian equality that I think will explode this narrative, which is built on trauma and has been fueled by political exploitation and has led to so much harm to Palestinians, and has also, I think, led to Jews in a certain point of way not being able to move on.
Okay, thank you. I'll frame a question to you, Yousef, now, and then I'd like to have some time for you all to interact with each other, and then we'll open it up to other questions from the participants. And I guess, Yousef, I'd like to ask you to explore a little bit more with us your statements in your article in Foreign Affairs on the one state, where you say that there needs to be a truth and reconciliation process focused on restorative justice as part of the work of building the one state, and building political partnerships between groups that have been damaged and estranged because of the very dehumanization that Peter's been talking about, and it exists on the other side as well. So could you say a little bit about that, what you envision by the truth and reconciliation process as it would work in this context, and also the notion of restorative justice as part of that work?
Yeah, thank you very much, Mark, for this question. I really appreciate it, and I think it's an opportunity to kind of develop a little bit on what Peter said in regards to the way he sort of hears settler colonialism and the the yes but or the yes and response to that. The reason why I think it is important to see things through this frame is not because I am looking to negate or think it is necessary to negate in any way Jewish connection to the land. I don't think that is necessary. I don't think that is helpful. And I don't think that is right. At the same time, I don't think it is right to ignore what the reality of settler colonialism has meant for Palestinians, continues to mean for Palestinians. And I don't think we can move forward without an honest reckoning about that. And at the same time, a genuine effort to try to approximate as much justice as possible for the implications of those processes, right? So we could come to an agreement today about the reality on the ground and say, look, two states is not going to work. One state is the only alternative at this point. Let's think about a way that we can draw up a constitution that would allow for power sharing and minority rights and equal protection, and all of these good and important things that need to be in any new construction that comes forward, any new political construction that comes forward. But I think we would be making a terrible mistake and not really addressing the problem if we leave it at that, right? Because there is real harm that was done to people over these years that continues to have a lasting impact in their lives today, right? When you're talking about nearly 2/3 of the native population of Palestine being, depopulated from their homes and denied repatriation for generations. What does that do to families? What does that do to families emotionally, psychologically, economically? right? How do we deal with that? How do we reverse that? How do we restore that? I think those are very important conversations that we have to have. And it begins by first having an honest reckoning about history. You know, not by saying, you know, 2,000 years ago, was there a Jewish state? Was there not a Jewish state? No. But let's talk about the people who are living here today, going to live as part of this future entity, right? How can we get as close to justice for them as possible, right? You know, no constitution alone is going to do that. There needs to be a process of trying to make people and communities and towns and villages whole again, right? For there not just to be peace on paper, for there not just to be a system that is drawn up to guarantee rights, but also a sense of justice among the people that live there. And that, and this is, we cannot approach this as zero sum. We cannot approach this as if there is some form of you know, support given to, justice given to, repatriation, reparation given to Palestinians, that somehow that has to negate something, right, from Israelis or from Jewish citizens or so on. That does not have to be the case, right? In fact, it would not be just if that is the case. The idea here is to look at ways, and I point in that article to truth and reconciliation as a possible way of doing that. And I just want to be clear that there are definitely strengths and weaknesses to that approach, and there are plenty of people who you know the history of South Africa and Rwanda and elsewhere, where these sort of processes and commissions have been tried that can go on for much longer than me about the strengths and weaknesses of those things. But we need to find a way to honestly reckon with the history, the recent history, the impact that it's had on the people that are still around today, and how we can put processes in place, bring us as close to justice for those historical wrongs as possible. Not by denying anything that it should be given to anybody else, but by reinstating what was taken from those it was taken from.
Peter, would you like to respond to that? I'd like to have some interchange between the two of you now. You both made general statements about one state as it fits into your ways of looking at these issues, and gone into a little depth on the meaning of tikkun in your context, and then the truth and reconciliation and restorative justice notion. What are some questions you would have for each other to look at common ground and also distinctive emphases?
It's for me.
Yes.
I mean, I agree with what Yousef just said. I mean, I think that we are having the beginnings of some kind of conversation, or have been in the last year or two in the United States, about a historical reckoning with the founding of the United States. And that I think one of the points that many of the central actors in that effort have made is the deep interconnectedness between the past and the present. And that's why people have responded so vociferously to the 1619 Project, right? Because they recognize that it's not just a series of arguments about theoretical things about what happened in the 17th and 18th century. It has profound implications for what kind of country the United States is going to be today. And I think that's the case in Israel-Palestine as well. So I entirely agree with that, and I think that it requires you know, what's interesting is that it's now almost 30 years since Israeli historians, you know, Palestinian historians had done some of this work earlier, but they didn't have access to Israeli archives. It's been about 30 years now since Israeli historians, not all of them super left-wing, but particularly Beinart, of course, started finding in the Israeli and the British archives the evidence that justified what people like Walid Khalidi and others had been saying about what actually happened in 1948. And in a way, it's quite depressing to me, actually, that 30 years later, that historical research by Israeli historians, you don't even need to read Palestinian historians in order to understand a lot of this stuff, although of course you should, that hasn't percolated into the public discourse, the Jewish discourse either in Israel or in the United States, or when it does. I think the most significant moment in which it has that I can think about was in Ari Shavit's book, where he makes this, I think it's a kind of remarkable move that he makes when you think about it, and in certain kind of way quite true. I think he basically says, the only way that I can make a conversation about the Nakba palatable in a mainstream kind of Jewish environment is to describe it and then justify it, right? And essentially that becomes I think the one moment that I can really think of where there's an actually kind of breaking through of that. But of course, that's deeply problematic. And so it's a sign to me of how far we, unfortunately, at least in my community, we are from the reckoning that I think Yousef is talking about, which is a reckoning, I think Desmond Tutu talked about in the South African case, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission as opening wounds so they don't fester, right? Opening wounds so then you can begin to cleanse and heal them, right? And not just so you can know the history, but you can actually do something about it, right? And which gets into things like Israeli land law, very deep-rooted things about the state and the way it was created that would take very fundamental work to start to undo. Anyway, so that's not a question, sorry, but it's a kind of a meditation on some of the things that Yousef was saying.
Yousef, anything you'd like to say in regard to that?
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't think there's any doubt about what Peter says about sort of the direction that Israelis have moved, and I think, it's kind of striking how, we are starting to see sort of very different movement here in the United States, right, which is itself a settler colonial country, and has its own very dark and very horrific history, which we all living here in the United States are still affected by, benefiting from perhaps, or harmed by, right? And we are starting, thanks to many younger generation activists and also very committed older generation activists who have been leading the way for many years, starting to have a different conversation about what our history here in the United States really was, what it's meant over the years, and how it's shaped our present. And I think, as I think about how much of a different direction Israel has gone in, and we'll just share with you, I've done my own research in Israeli military archives and the Haganah archives, and it's not for a generation of Israelis, for an older generation of Israelis, none of this is really a secret. Particularly the generation of Israelis that fought in the military in 1948. Many of them know exactly what happened. They participated in what was taking place on the ground. And some of them came to rationalize it in their own ways. Some of them perhaps remain traumatized by it. But a younger generation of Israelis has been sort of taught to justify it in completely different ways. And some of what Peter has mentioned earlier about the vilification of Palestinians, enabling pretty much, anything, any sort of violence towards them. When you think that Benjamin Netanyahu, for example, only a few years ago, attempted to blame the final solution, Hitler's final solution, on a Palestinian. That is the extent to which the really disturbing revision of history is being taken to justify sort of this unending iron wall solution for the Israeli relationship to Palestinians. But as I think of the what is happening here in the United States, I do see hope. I see hope from that. One, because it shows me that that kind of change is possible, but also because of the importance of the United States in this equation. And I think this is something that I know there are questions that are coming in this chat, and many of them are forward-facing questions about what can we do and so on and so forth. For me, one of the most inspiring things is seeing how the change in the conversation in the United States about our own history is starting to bleed into other conversations, and including not just about America's own history with racism and colonialism, but also the role of colonialism around the world, the role of European colonialism, the importance of thinking critically about history, not just here, but in other places. And I think that is a cultural shift that portends, I think, very well for the kind of change that needs to happen here in the United States for us to get to a point where the United States can be a more helpful player in moving Israelis and Palestinians in the right direction.
Peter, anything more on that? Any response from?
No, I agree. I guess I'll just pick up where Yousef left off. In the longer run, it's not intellectually coherent to essentially embrace the kind of currents of political discourse that are taking place vis-a-vis race in the United States, and then basically have a kind of see no evil position on Israel. But it is, I think, significant that is actually what a lot of mainstream establishment American Jewish organizations are trying to do. It's only the far right ones, like Zionist Organization for America, which basically say, we hate Black Lives Matter, it's all lefty garbage, right? That's also that would be a more discourse you hear more in Israel. But it is really significant and it speaks to the power of the discourse in terms of what's happening in the US, that so many establishment politicians and organizations essentially have embraced a certain kind of line of discourse without, I think, but that line of discourse is ultimately deeply destabilizing to the kind of arguments that they're trying to have with Israel-Palestine. Now, just because something is intellectually incoherent doesn't mean it can't endure, right? I mean, politics is about power, probably more than it is about intellectual coherence. But I do think one of the things that could change this discourse is that right now the Israel-Palestinian discourse in the United States is kind of a niche discourse, right? It's dominated by a in kind of high-profile media. It's dominated by a relatively small number of people. Most of them are Jewish, and there are many writers who write on issues, other kinds of issues in the United States, right? Racial justice issues, all kinds of other justice issues in the United States, who just stay away from these issues, right? Because it's not their niche. Maybe they feel afraid of the conversation. Maybe they feel like it requires some expertise that they don't have. I think if they actually realize, it doesn't require an expertise that they don't have. All it requires is actually for them to apply their own values in a straightforward way. And I think that if more of those folks, right? I mean, let's say Ta-Nehisi Coates decided to write on this topic, right? Or Nicole Hannah-Jones, right? I mean, when Michelle Alexander wrote about it, it was significant, even though it was only one op-ed, right? When it becomes less of a niche issue in the left, in progressive circles, you know, then I think when more people at MSNBC feel comfortable essentially just applying the things they say about the United States to this, that I think will produce a significant shift.
Okay, let me shift to a couple of the questions that have come in from our participants. Here's one that maybe gets us a little bit more to political realities in this country. This one says, the biggest problem to a just resolution is the U.S. Unqualified support for the right-wing Zionists, which denies Palestinian rights altogether. If the U.S. changes its position to support a one-state Israel, Israel may follow or be forced to follow. How can we make the USA see the light? So there's a question here about political transformation of this unqualified support from our government and the current right-wing government in Israel. What would y'all say about that?
Maybe I'll.
Yeah, go ahead, Bora. Yeah.
So, I mean, I think it's important to keep in mind that the United States is not going to do the right thing here unless it is forced to do the right thing. And that doesn't only go for Israel-Palestine policy, but I think it goes for foreign policy more generally. You know, we should keep in mind that you know, was an American administration that was you know, willing to you know, go against even its own Congress to continue supporting South Africa in the late up until the late 1980s, right? So you know, it will take a movement. It will take a significant effort to move U.S. policy. And I think it will take an effort here in the United States and also on the ground in Israel-Palestine. There are all kinds of missing components on the ground in Israel-Palestine that we haven't even started to talk about yet, which are also important. But what I do want to say is that when it comes to this question of one state or two, what I think is powerful about the one state vision is that it actually creates far better conditions for movement building, for mobilizing people, particularly here in the United States, than does the two-state frame. The reality is that you know, most people here in the United States don't really know a whole lot about Israel-Palestine, let alone know, you know, what side of what village or what settlement a particular line should be drawn through, right? But they understand the message of equal rights. They understand the importance of equality before the law. They understand the wrongness of ethnic-based discrimination, racism, and so on, right? And these are all messages and mobilizers within a single state equal rights frame that could bring in a much larger swath of people than the, you know, the traditional conversation, which has been limited to the niche spaces that Peter mentioned. So in the big picture, it is going to take a movement, but I do think that within this frame, we have a better chance of creating the kind of movement that will lead to change than anything else, particularly here in the United States.
Peter, would you like to comment on that question about what it will take to move the U.S. in its politics more toward what you all are talking about?
Sorry. First of all, I do think that it's hard for me to imagine that movement reaching critical mass in the United States unless there's substantial change on the ground. I mean, there obviously any analogy is problematic, but to go to the South Africa analogy, the anti-apartheid movement would not have grown around the world in the way it did in the 1980s had the UDF, the United Democratic Front, which was essentially the ANC's proxy inside the country, had a massive campaign that at tremendous cost to Black South Africans to raise the cost internally. And to force the issue onto the front pages around the world, and to make people and to bring the images to light that then drove the moral outrage around the world. I would just say, in all honesty, one of the really difficult things about engaging in this conversation as a non-Palestinian, right, is it's not for me to advise the Palestinian national movement, right? And it's not, Palestinians can say things about their own movement. It's not really for me to start saying, this person is collaborationist, this person is not. But essentially, if Palestinian leadership on the ground seems to basically be facilitating the system of oppression, I think that limits what can happen here or anywhere else around the world, partly just because it keeps things quiet and it keeps it off the front page, if nothing else. In terms of what can happen here, I mean, I agree with you what Yousef said. I do think, one challenge, there are a couple of challenges. Of course, the anti-apartheid movement was, significant part of it was led by the Congressional Black Caucus and by African Americans who had, for obvious reasons, a particular connection to what was happening. I think one of the critical questions, it seems to me, all people should, and many people do care, right? But it does seem to me there's going to be a way in which Palestinian and Arab and maybe Muslim Americans have a particular connection to the plight of Palestinians. And so one critical question, I think, is going to be, are they allowed to develop as a community in the way that other, if these are communities that are largely come to the United States in the last generation or two, right? Not entirely, but largely. And so would naturally go through, I think, a kind of natural process where the first generation born in the United States will feel more comfortable essentially playing the political game and becoming more politically articulate and influential, right? I think a critical question will be, is that allowed to happen in the United States, right? Or does, this process, I think, has been retarded by September 11th and its legacy, right? I think we would be further along in this process had we had not the kind of wave of Islamophobia that 9/11 helped to justify. And so I think that's a really, really critical question, right? I think it's why it's really important that Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar won re-election, but there's still very, very few folks like that. And frankly, I think my sense is even some folks who do come from that community basically would, if they want to get ahead politically, feel like the safest way would be just to keep their head down. So I think that's one critical question for us to ask about this. And the other is also just that, I think one other difference between America in the 1980s and America now is that America internally is in such horrific shape, right? With such profound questions about our own society, that I do worry that may limit the activist bandwidth for people who would otherwise be focusing on Israel-Palestine in some of the ways that they focused on, let's say, South Africa, or for that matter, Central America, let's say in the 1980s.
That's a good segue to another question here, which deals specifically with electoral issues. It says, recognizing the need to vote, especially in this election, but deploring the Democratic National Committee and Biden-Harris campaign's failure to address continued military aid and support of Israel's apartheid colonization, how can we more effectively use our electoral power? And I would just say, I remember hearing that when the spokesman for the Biden-Harris campaign essentially threw Linda Sarsour under the bus and distanced the Biden-Harris campaign from her, that when there was pushback from the Palestinian and the Muslim American community, one of the things that came out was, we have an important voting bloc in Michigan, which is an important state. And we'd like to be taken seriously and respected, not only for our rights as Palestinians and the brilliant organizing work that Linda Sarsour has done, but also for the political power that we are demonstrating. And it was interesting that that seemed to change the discussion a bit from what I could tell. So either one of you feel free to pick up on either aspect of that, but the question about how to use our electoral power more effectively.
Yeah, we'll just one bit that relates to this on something that Peter said. Look, you know, I understand the awkwardness of trying to have this conversation, or talk about this subject as a non-Palestinian, and the reality is, you know, the sort of the Palestinian House has there's a lot that needs to get in order, and there's no short of conversation about that among Palestinians, I can assure you. And you probably heard plenty of it as well. We're pretty well aware of the shortcomings of the leadership and know that that is an obstacle. All of that being said, you know, as people having this conversation in the United States, and as people who are also Americans and taxpayers and talking to taxpayers in the United States, the absence of a really effective Palestinian force on the ground to campaign for change should not prevent us from asking what we can do to at least address the complicity of our own government in ongoing human rights abuses on the ground. And so I think that's while I agree with you that there needs to be a catalyst on the ground, a Palestinian catalyst on the ground, to get behind a political effort like this, and there isn't one right now, and there's a whole host of reasons why. That is not a reason for us to not have the other part of this conversation, which we need to have. And I think that's where our focus needs to be right now. And I think this question, you know, is an opportunity to think about that a little bit. You know, I know that there's plenty to be frustrated about. Personally, I've had a lot of frustrations about some of the things that I've seen coming out of, you know, the Biden campaign, particularly, you know, what was done around Linda Sarsour and some other things. You know, I won't even get into a conversation about the problems with the Trump administration and the Republican Party and all of what they have done and said about Arabs and Muslims and Palestinians and so on. But I do think there has been a tremendous amount of progress, and the last place that you are going to see progress is at the top of the ticket. What is so encouraging to me is the changes that you're starting to see bubble up from the bottom. And you know, for people who are thinking about how can we get involved, first of all, there's a lot of different people to vote for other than president. I'm not saying you shouldn't vote for president. You obviously should you know, do what you think is right. But there are a lot of offices in our government at various levels, and there are a lot of ways for people to get involved. You know, at their municipal level, at their state level, and so on. So you know, electoral politics is obviously much bigger than just the presidential ticket. And also keep in mind that, you know, one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons that American policy is what it is and has been stuck that way for so long, and we see the forces at the top of these parties so hesitant to move away from this orthodoxy, is because there have been communities of people and interest groups who have been doing this work in a committed way for a very, very, very long time. And it's going to take a similarly committed effort over time to create that change. And it's not going to start at the top of the ticket, right? It's gonna start by getting your friends and your allies and your partners elected to the school boards and elected to the city councils, and start their political careers with the right values and with the right friends and with the right supporters, the right politics, and build upwards from there. So, you know, I say that to be realistic. I don't say that to discourage anybody. But I think that's the way that change, if change is going to happen in this country, that's the way it will happen. And I will just offer you this to conclude in response. When there is a sort of paradigm shifting moment in American politics on this issue, it's probably not going to come when we expect it. And it's very hard to tell how close critical mass really is on transformational change. So I think the answer is to continue to get involved and to continue pushing, and ultimately there will be change.
Peter, here's a question that came in. I'd be curious about your take on it. Let me just read it. This is a American Jewish context. When we Jews realize the horrible error of our ways and admit we were wrong, and we ask forgiveness, and we ask all Palestinian refugee families to return to their homes and villages, and we pledge to rebuild their homes and villages together, and the Palestinians agree, and there is a democratic state for all its citizens, and the economy is better, and there is peace, and the tourist economy is stronger than ever, and everyone is sharing in the bounty. He asks, will we Jews be satisfied with that? What do you think? What I hear in that is a kind of a mourning over a lost nationalism, over perhaps the Greater Israel Project. What do you think about how Israeli Jews will respond in the rosiest of scenarios around a one state? Do you think that most Jews would be in Israel would be partners and in that project? How many would, I've heard some people suggest it would be a bridge too far for many Israeli Jews, and they might immigrate rather than share the space with Palestinians. What's your sense about this?
I mean, it's so speculative.
Yeah.
You know, but there's something I love about the idea of basically, you know, anyway, the question is something, there's something lovely about the question in a way. I mean,
Yes.
I think that, look, I think there is a very, even in the most optimistic scenario in terms of, let's say, the kind of most peaceful process and most kind of, you know, the process of fundamental transformation, you're still going to have to, Israeli Jews are still going to have to kind of reckon with the fact that they have been living in a way that's based on them dominating resources and allowing very few resources for the Palestinians that live alongside them, and that will change life for Israeli Jews, even under the most optimistic of scenarios. And so I think there is a question under those circumstances of whether how many Israeli Jews might decide, you know, that they would rather go, if to the degree that they could, to go live, you know, in Canada or Australia or whoever. And it's interesting. I did a conversation recently with a fairly prominent kind of liberal Zionist Israeli, and she said, quite frankly, she said to me, and I've heard other Israelis say this, basically, I came to this part of the world to live in a Jewish state, to live in a Jewish majority. If that doesn't exist, I don't need to be here. And in a funny way, I think that is almost built into some of the Jewish conversation and anxiety, right? Essentially, that this is going to be another Arab country, right? Well, you know, numerically it's going to tip. Well, if it's going to, that might be a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? If a lot of Israeli Jews leave, it's really difficult to know. I mean, in the most optimistic scenario, I think you would find that there would be Israeli Jews who found a different way of actually connecting to living in the Middle East, you know, rather than the kind of the oppositional kind of one of Barak's, you know, kind of villa in a jungle way, right? And in a way, you might say that the most natural population to do that and to be a bridge to do that would be Mizrahi Jews, right? Who come from the Middle East. You know, there's in a way, the fact that they have not served as a bridge, but in fact have become a kind of right-wing political force in Israel is one of the most tragic kind of developments that's taken place in this conflict. And, you know, the common discourse that you will find among in many kind of Mizrahi Jewish communities is, well, of course, because, you know, we know what the Arabs are like, so we have no illusions about them, right? But of course, but I actually think the more compelling, if you try to, and you know, my own grandmother who was born in Egypt would say things like that. And yet I think if you dig underneath the surface, you know, I think Rachel Shabi in her book, We Look Like the Enemy, does a really good job of this, you know, is actually what you see is essentially the need to reject your own Arabness in order to be accepted by the Jewish state, you know, especially in the 1950s, you know, when it was even more Ashkenazi dominated and even more racist towards Mizrahi Jews than it is today. And so maybe that might be a community that could, you know, it's funny. Anyway, that might be perhaps a beginning, but of some of this bridge building. I also think that Palestinian citizens of Israel are a critical force in this, right? They, in some ways, I think, are the bridge community because they not just because they have Israeli citizenship, but because they speak Hebrew generally, and because they're deeply familiar with Israeli society, even if they have a very hostile view towards it, they understand it intimately. And I think it's why a lot of the most I think interesting and impressive political leadership in this conflict is right now coming from the elected political leaders in the Palestinian political leaders inside Israel.
Here's a question about Adala Justice released a poll today showing a majority of Democrats are willing to reduce aid to Israel because of its treatment of Palestinians. How can we use such information to influence democratic policy given the Biden-Harris's and Congress's, majority of Congress's resistance to this? I guess it's sort of the disjunction between shifts in the political discourse and what's reflected at the representative level in Congress. Either one of you?
Yeah, I mean, you know, there's a lot I want to say about the last question, but maybe
go ahead. That's fine.
No,
go ahead.
I think because we could go on for a while about that. But I also thought it was fascinating. But I think this question is important too. Look, we've been seeing a number of these polls over the last 10 years or so. And I do think they're really important. I think they're indicative of a shift in attitudes in the United States. I don't think we should underestimate the significance of that. They've tended to coincide with this broader partisan divide in attitudes around Israel-Palestine. There's a whole host of reasons for that that I think are many decades old. But I think the question was, how can we use this, you know, to kind of influence our elected representatives? You know, the sad reality is that in this country, at least I think it's sad, the vast overwhelming majority of Americans, upwards of 90% of people, think that there needs to be some sort of common sense gun control reform, gun reform, right? Background checks, what have you, right? We hear it discussed all the time. And despite that, despite this overwhelming consensus, little change happens. And that's because the reality of the matter is, in American politics, interest groups matter a lot. And, you know, I think that it's important for people to not just rely on these tectonic shifts, which I do think are important and are going to help change come sooner than later, but to also be organized in a focused way. And I want to applaud the work that you know, the VJP group is doing. and getting organized within your community. And I know that that's not new, and you guys have been engaged with your representatives and are looking to grow and so on. But you know, that I think is more effective. Walking into a member of Congress's office or a local representative's office with 4 or 5 constituents or 4 or 5 donors or what have you will probably get you a lot further than what a particular poll might say. But that poll might help that member of Congress realize that, you know, the winds are starting to shift, and this is not as politically third rail as it once was. And there are so many things that we can point to beyond polls to show that. One only needs to look at, you know, the results of recent primary elections to understand that, you know, things are not what they used to be when it comes to, you know, Israel politics in this country.
Okay.
Mike,
You're on mute, Mark.
You're muted, Mark.
All right, got it. Here we go. Thank you. Sorry. Critics of the one state say that it plays right into the Israeli right wing by undermining the effort to end the occupation and appears to give legitimacy to the settlement and annexation projects. What do you all, how would you respond to that? And another question is raised, do the speakers support annexation as a way to get to the one state? We've said that it's already a de facto one state, but to get to the place where it's more de jure, more out in the open sovereignty, and then move through a civil rights struggle toward greater equality for all the citizens. Basically, it's how do you see annexation in relation to the one state? Whichever one of you wants to tackle that one first is fine.
I mean, look, I would say I understand the argument that says bring annexation on, right? It dispels the myth. I guess I have two anxieties about that argument. The first is that I do think annexation does produce an additional level of harm beyond the harm that exists now, right? As difficult as the life is for Palestinians in area C, for instance, now, or Palestinian, the annexation will essentially, I think, just exacerbate the tremendous difficulties in movement. It will exacerbate even more land expropriation. Yes, these things are happening anyway, but I think it will exacerbate those things. Now, the argument for doing them would be, well, yes, but there will be this political backlash to annexation, which will allow the movement for change to gain greater strength. Maybe, but you know, I have to say, I mean, we did go through this summer where we kind of saw what American politics, and for that matter, European politics, would look like on the cusp of annexation. And what did we get? We mostly got, you know, we got some letters from Democratic senators saying, please, Democratic members of Congress saying, please don't do it, right? It wasn't, I mean, I think it was actually, frankly, pretty depressing. I mean, it did not spur, really, a significant number of people who were not already in support of conditioning aid or some form of sanctions to take that position. I think basically it was a kind of rhetorical opposition and a kind of a, frankly, a collective shrug. So, so I guess those would be my thoughts about annexation.
Yousef, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the reasons, Peter, why we didn't see too much response is because while a lot of people don't want to say that they know that you know the train's already left the station on 2 states, between them and themselves, they know that that's the case. It's just not politically possible to say or do much about that yet. And obviously we're missing a Palestinian component on the ground that's ready to push for that. But you know, the reality of annexation is it already exists on the ground. It has for a very, very long time. Israel's control over the territory is only deepening. And what I would say to the initial question you asked about, does one state legitimize the settlements and so on and so forth? No, I don't think anything will legitimize the settlements. The settlements continue to be violations of international law. They continue to be violations of the Geneva Conventions, and international law doesn't disappear just because one shifts to a different paradigm. I think that it remains important and they remain wrong. And I would also point to the fact that, nothing has done more to accelerate Israeli settlement expansion than the diplomacy around the two-state framework. And it was, in fact, after the PLO's recognition of the Israeli state and the beginning of the Oslo process that we saw the single most significant period of settlement expansion in post-67 history. I think what has happened because of that is that the Israelis have got the message, is that the more we take and lay claim to, the more the Palestinians will eventually recognize. And they will have their state maybe one day on an ever-shrinking piece of land. And if they don't like it, they can, move to Jordan or whatever else is in their minds. But I think actually that two-state approach has done more to set Palestinians back than anything else.
It seems obvious that if U.S. politics will ever respond to the notion of a one state, it's going to have to be because of the changes that exist or come to exist on the ground in Palestine-Israel. There are a couple questions about that. In a one-state vision, what changes would have to take place in the military, the prison system, distribution of water, land, economic, health, and other social resources, in political representation and laws on the books, all of which have acted to cement Israeli apartheid? So this is kind of the more pragmatic question of, okay, so we're talking about a one state, and it's no longer just a theoretical vision or a hope for the future, but it's as it functions as a practical political reality. Would the project begin to identify each of the 60 some odd discriminatory laws and start to dismantle those one at a time? Adalah, the Legal Center for the Arab Minority Rights in Israel, has identified a democratic constitution, sort of a model for that. What are the practical steps that activists on the ground, Palestinian and the few Israeli activists who might join this project, what could they set their sights on in pragmatic terms to begin to start moving the needle? Or is that premature?
I think that one thing that I would hope for would be that you could see the emergence of a kind of genuine Jewish Palestinian left inside Israeli politics. Obviously, the kind of Jewish left is pretty much, non-existent at this point, and the joint list is, first of all, kind of locked out of being considered part of Israel's coalition governments, and has made some strides in gaining more Jewish support, but still, I think, has a long way to go. And I think for it to kind of win over most of the people who have been voting for Meretz, in recent years, for instance, right? Let alone those who were voting for labor. And I think that's difficult work for a lot of reasons. I mean, it's not an easy bridge it's not an easy political movement to create. But I do think that would be the political movement that would, I think, be a force for tremendous change and hope. And the work that would happen inside that movement and the relationships that would be built, I think would be really, truly crucial. And I think in Ayman Odeh and others, you have a leadership of that movement that has, I think, reached out to Jewish voters and to Jewish Israelis in really dramatic and powerful ways that I think could be reciprocated, and I would hope be reciprocated. And I think one potential, thing, I mentioned this in my piece, and it's controversial, I know, but would be essentially also to think about how this might play out at the municipal level in cities that have mixed populations. Haifa would be one, for instance. But then there's also the question of whether you would, if you do see a movement towards a one-state paradigm, does that lead more Palestinians in East Jerusalem to reconsider their boycotting of the municipal elections in Jerusalem? And if there was to be some reconsidering of that boycotting, could you have Jerusalem as offering a kind of a model for politics that allowed the creation of coalitions that don't really exist in Israel today, where you might have the election of a mayor of Jerusalem elected in part based on Palestinian as well as Jewish votes, for instance. That could be a model for the country as a whole. So those are some things that I think perhaps could be steps forward.
Yousef, what do you think about that sort of more pragmatic steps, and also in response to what Peter said regarding the joint list or new political coalitions forming?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think this is a really important question. It's a big question. There are variations of this that we hear all the time. What does the military look like? What will the government structure be? Does it have a name? Does it have a flag? What's going to be the national anthem? Is it going to have a national bird? All of this good stuff, right? I think that I certainly have my views as an individual and someone who studies politics on what I personally think might make the most sense for a stable and just, Israel-Palestine. But the reality is that whatever it's going to be is going to have to be something that is that involves a broad cross section of stakeholders among Israelis and Palestinians at the generative stages of creating that. I think there are some elements of the Israeli political system that make sense to maintain, but also a lot that gotta go. I think it's important that you have a representative parliament or a representative body and a lawmaking body and an independent judiciary. I think there's questions about the independence and representation, obviously, of those institutions in Israel. But those elements, I think, are important. A lot of other things, I think, are deeply, deeply problematic. But again, we can talk about drawing up that constitution, but I really want to emphasize that that's, a step in creating one state, but it doesn't go nearly as far as we need to go to get to a solution. I think that involves really looking at a lot of different processes that have started playing out from before 1948 and after. Peter mentioned just one of them. When we talk about, land, for example, there's an entire system that was developed in Israel for taking and controlling and dispensing land from Palestinians to and for the use of Israeli Jews, that is something that absolutely has to change, and there are many other resources and many other systems built around dominating resources that need to be changed. So it's a really, really big question. All of this is to say that I think at the fundamental level, it needs to be guided by core principles. And I talk about some of these principles in the piece that I wrote in Foreign Affairs. But I think, the most important ones are equality before the law and this idea of co-permanence, that there is a shared recognition between both communities that their belonging is not the negation of the other communities belonging in this space, right? That is really important. And I think, there are going to be lots of difficult political questions that follow after that. But I think a lot becomes possible if we can build around those principles.
Hey, the 8:30 hour is upon us. There's been a couple of suggestions in the chat that we see if the speakers would be willing to extend for a few more minutes. There's still many questions there. Another 10 minutes or so. Are you all game for that? Is that all right?
Okay.
All right. Yousef is okay with you? All right. Let's go a few more minutes. Here's a comment. Dr. Munayyer highlighted the right of return. What does he think of Abu Sita's demographics claiming that there is room for refugees to return without displacing anyone who lives there now? Just that whole question of how would the right of return work in practice?
Well, look, there's a short and long answer to this question, but I would just tell you that the way that people who deal with the question of the right of return in a two-state framework is they say, well, that question will be resolved within the Palestinian state, right, which is 22% of Palestine. So if there's space for them in 22% of Palestine, I'm sure there's space for 8% of Palestine, right? So that's the short answer. The long answer is, there's been a lot of really, really, really important work done on the practical implementation of repatriation. And I would encourage people to look at that. There's no way I can do it justice now. But the vast majority of Palestinian towns and villages from which Palestinian refugees were depopulated remain empty today. And so, I think that is an important starting point. I think most people don't really realize that. I think people can check out the Deal Resource Center, which has done really, really important work on this. I think, Dr. Salman Abu Sitta has also done some very important work on this. And I think it's important for people to begin imagining not just what return can look like, but also how it can become economically sustainable as well. Because this is not just about the return of people to specific places, but also the creation of communities, the recreation of communities. And we have to think about how economically and politically that all becomes integrated into the country.
Here's another one. Do you think, as does scholar Joseph Mossad, that political Zionism was founded on the basis of anti-Semitism?
Is that for me or?
Yeah, why don't you take that one, Peter?
I think that we were clearly anti-Semites who were enamored with the Zionist idea because they liked the idea of Jews leaving their countries and going somewhere else, right? I think Yousef has written about Arthur Balfour, who, supported the 1905 Aliens Act in Britain, which basically, prevented Eastern European Jews from coming to Britain. I think the Zionist movement was also benefited in a kind of an odd way, I think, from certain anti-Semitic stereotypes about Jewish power, which led some European and American statesmen to believe that somehow if they got on the right side of the Jews, that would be very important for them because the Jews were so powerful politically and economically. I think people like Chaim Weizmann kind of played on those anti-Semitic stereotypes quite kind of effectively. It's also true that the Zionism itself obviously took a dim view of the kind of what they would have called the kind of Jewish diaspora personality, right? That partly what Zionism was about doing was essentially to say, Jews have become in diaspora Jews are, you know, an urban, effete, cosmopolitan, deracinated population, weak, and we want to reinvent what it means to be a Jew, right? So there were ways in which this language drew on certain anti-Semitic stereotypes about Jews, but I don't think it would be fair to call those Jewish Zionists essentially anti-Semites. They just wanted a kind of radical shift in the Jewish condition. So again, some of it because I think of, you know, and some of it was because of an understandable fear that Jews were in grave danger, you know, in Europe as the, you know, and that in fact turned out to be the case. So anyway, so I think that there were ways in which anti-Semitism, anti-Semites and anti-Semitic tropes and Zionist tropes and people kind of locked arms, but I don't think I would say that I think anti-Semitism was in any way the essence of Zionism.
Here's one more question. Again, taking us back to sort of the depth of rage and frustration in the Palestinian street. Someone says, would an intensified intifada help move a one-state human rights resolution, and who would its Palestinian leaders be? So again, a movement away, I guess, from political partnerships toward a one-state, pragmatic, long-term, multi-generational change to the role of the intifada or a third intifada in all of this. What do you all think about that? Yousef, you want to tackle that first?
Well, I'm not quite sure what's intended by the question, what's intended by the use of the term. But I can tell you, I do think that for there to be real change on the ground, there will have to be some kind of broad-based Palestinian mobilization. And at the end of the day, that's what an intifada is. An intifada is a broad uprising. And there are people who want to characterize that in a way that necessitates violence or militancy. I'm not saying that that's the case at all. But you know, when one looks through Palestinian history, there have been many moments where there have been national uprisings, including in the 1930s and in the 1980s and so on. And I think, you know, they have been at their most effective when they have been broad-based, popular, nonviolent demonstrations and civil disobedience. And I think there is, you know, a much bigger conversation to be had about this, but it's hard to see how real change happens without broad mobilization among Palestinians in a way that makes clear that the message is for you know, within a rights-based frame and for an outcome of shared you know, shared homeland and justice for Israelis and Palestinians alike.
Okay. We're going to need to stop the questions at this point with the hopeful note that we are going to be able to record all of the chats, and we're going to try to get back to you as best we can with the wonderful questions that have come in. Thanks to all of you for taking the time to frame them. And if you've had a chance to look at them as they've been going along, there's some great questions there. So just the last couple of minutes, just some closing thoughts from each of you about the most important next steps that we as individuals can take in our personal activism, personal commitment to justice, also our work with organizations, our intersectional work with around Black Lives Matter activism, a host of issues that interconnect. What are your thoughts about sort of hopeful, inspiring, concrete steps that individuals who care about justice in Palestine and here could take? Just your thoughts about next steps for the audience members. Peter, why don't you go first on that one, and then Yousef, if you could close us out, that'd be great.
You're on mute, Peter.
Muted, Peter.
Yeah, here we go. Okay. I think one of the things that the kind of establishment Jewish organizations like AIPAC do extremely effectively, of course it helps, they have a lot of resources, but is they take a ton of people on trips to the region. I think that when people go for themselves, they come away with a sense of confidence to discuss the issue, right? And I think that happens whether you go on an AIPAC trip, which gives you the kind of Israeli government narrative, but it happens if you go on a trip that where you actually interact with Palestinians in a serious way and you actually see for yourself. And I think that to the degree that could be scaled up among people who care about Palestinian rights, I think it would have a very significant impact. It's not easy to do, obviously, for a variety of reasons, but I think it could have a huge impact. I think in terms of on the ground in the United States, that the kind of bringing people together that you've done and that other local communities do is really, really critical. And I guess I would just say, maybe particularly to the Jewish members of this conversation who might be here, I think that your challenge, our challenge as I perceive it, is to try to live in two worlds, which is to say, it is once one starts to engage in a community in which Palestinians exist, it all of a sudden becomes hard to be in many mainstream Jewish communities for a variety of reasons. And one can often become, frankly, appalled, again, in the same way that maybe it's not some ways that, someone who, that going back and forth can create a certain kind of schizophrenia in a certain kind of way. And yet I think it's really, really crucial that Jews try to do that, which is to say, if you, in your work in creating a political coalition and community with Palestinians and others who care about Palestinian rights, essentially say, well, to heck with the mainstream Jewish community and with those Jewish institutions, you lose your ability to actually influence them. You lose your ability to try to be the bridge that allows them to go on that journey themselves. And I think that that's one thing that I think is really important for Jews who are involved in this work to do, is to try to stay inside those Jewish communities that need you to be the leverage point for other people to change, rather than simply saying, I want nothing more to do with these folks.
Thank you. Yousef?
So I think there's a number of things that you could do. I think, it starts with thinking about our own individual complicity in the situation, in our own community's complicity in the situation, our own town, our own government's complicity in the situation, and ways in which we can begin addressing that. I think everyone knows that I've been a strong proponent of, boycott, divestment, and sanctions. I continue to be. And I do think that, when we talk about some of the poll numbers that we mentioned earlier today about, the number of people who are willing to support limiting aid to Israel, all of that, I don't think that kind of change would have been possible if not for the efforts that have been going on for many years at the community, local, church, university level to begin addressing community and institutional complicity in the situation. So boycott and divestment is a very important driver, I believe, of the possibility of sanctions one day being possible. And I think that work needs to continue. And I would encourage folks who are involved in it to continue to do so, and those who are BDS curious to find out more. I would also say events like this are really important, and I applaud you guys for doing it. And I would also say, you know, this issue, I mean, for many people who may be on this call and often in these conversations, this is a conversation among people for whom this is their issue. This is the most important issue for them. They're Israel-Palestine people, and that's great. We obviously need people like that. But at the end of the day, this is a justice issue. And the way forward has to involve building coalitions with like-minded people who are not just Israel-Palestine people, but are justice people across the board. And that also means being a justice person across the board yourself and showing up for other struggles and other communities who, God knows, need you know, people to stand up and stand with them as well. So think about how to build and broaden coalitions by talking the talk and walking the walk alongside those who are struggling for justice in their own communities. And yeah, I think I'll leave it at that.
It's a good place to conclude. I remember hearing recently from Angela Davis, a great mother of the Black liberation struggle, who said she's come to believe that freedom is not a state, but a process and a journey. And in that sense, we're always on the way toward greater freedom, and not just for our own particular issue, but as we make bridges to our own communities and to other communities to do that important work. Thank you so much, Peter and Yousef, for your contributions and your openness with each other and with all of us, your willingness to extend and extend the time to get a few more of these questions in. Sanjita, thanks for your logistical help in making this happen, and to all of you for joining in. You've made this an important event, and we hope to have many more in the future. Thanks so much to all of you for participating tonight. Look for final communications through your emails. The webinar offers some great features of follow-up, so we look forward to staying in touch. Thanks to all of you, and that concludes our webinar this evening. Good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.